On the 4th of April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded in Washington, D.C. Of the 12 founding members, most were former members of the Western Allies during the Second World War, like the United States, the UK, and France. Others, like Italy, were nations who had lost the war and then completely transformed their political systems. The odd one out was Portugal, a country controlled by António Salazar and the Estado Novo, a corporatist movement closely aligned with the fascist powers in the 1930s. But now Salazar was allying with the Western powers. What explains how this Portuguese dictator not only managed to survive the fascist era, but thrive in office for over 36 years? This is the story of António de Oliveira Salazar, the controversial corporatist dictator of Portugal. The man known to history as António de Oliveira Salazar was born on the 28th of April 1889 in the village of Vimeiro in north-central Portugal. Unusually, Salazar preferred his mother's surname over his father's. His father was António de Oliveira. He began life as a farm worker before taking up a position as an estate manager for the wealthy Perestrello family, which enabled him to acquire a small plot of land of his own. In 1881, at the age of 40, he married a distant cousin, Maria do Rescate Salazar. Already 36 years old at the time of her marriage, Maria Salazar gave birth to 4 daughters, Marta, Elisa, Leopoldina, and Laura, in very quick succession after marrying. She was consequently 44 years old when she gave birth to her last child and only son, Antonio Jr. The couple worked hard to improve the family's fortunes, and by the time of Antonio's birth, they had acquired a degree of thin financial security. Despite the family's modest economic fortunes, they, and Portugal as a whole, remained relatively poor. While Portugal had been the first European power to build an overseas colonial empire in the 15th and 16th centuries, and had also enjoyed a gold rush in Brazil in the 18th century, domestically the Kingdom of Portugal was a backwater where little more than subsistence agriculture was practiced. The country's economic fortunes suffered further when it became a major front in the Napoleonic Wars from 1807 onwards. In 1821, Brazilian troops mutinied against the government. Crown Prince Pedro of Portugal sided with the revolutionaries against his autocratic father, King João VI, and proclaimed himself Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. Civil wars and internal unrest followed in Portugal for many years to come. While the old aristocratic elite was gradually replaced by a new liberal elite, little changed for most Portuguese people. Portugal remained a poor country, and, while it retained its undeveloped colonies in Africa around modern-day Angola and Mozambique, it had lost Brazil, and with it the source of its previous colonial wealth and power. Despite this challenging environment for social and economic progress, Salazar's parents were intent on providing their son with a good education. In 1900, the 10-year-old Salazar began his studies at a Roman Catholic seminary in Viseu, the provincial capital. The course included a 5-year preparatory cycle in arts and sciences, followed by 3 years of theological studies. In 1908, Salazar fulfilled his early academic promise and graduated at the top of his class. He did so during a particularly volatile period in Portuguese politics, shortly after the assassination of King Carlos I and his son, Crown Prince Luís. The slain king was succeeded by his younger son, King Manuel II. The incident shocked Salazar and strengthened his conservative political instincts. Salazar received minor religious orders upon graduation, but although he was being called Father Salazar by the townsfolk, he decided against life in the priesthood. His decision may have been prompted by his falling in love with Felizmina de Oliveira. and while the relationship did not last, the pair remained lifelong friends. Salazar spent 2 years teaching history, literature and mathematics at Viseo's Via Sacra College before applying for admission to the University of Coimbra. His academic record and excellent examination results easily earned him admission into Portugal's oldest university. Since the family could not afford to pay for his tuition, he earned an income from private tutoring. The beginning of Salazar's university education coincided with the fall of the Portuguese monarchy on the 5th of October 1910. King Manuel II was compelled to abdicate and go into exile in England following a military coup. Salazar's political activities intensified during his time at Coimbra. He had already begun contributing political articles to local newspapers in Viseu in 1908 and 1909. In which he lamented the anti-clericalism in Lisbon and argued that the Catholic Church had an important part to play in maintaining political order in Portugal during an era of upheaval. He followed the Church's neutral line on the question of the monarchy and believed that Catholics should organize themselves as an effective electoral force to prevent the further erosion of the Church's status. He soon joined the Christian Democrat Academic Centre, where he befriended Manuel Cerejeira, a young priest who would later become Patriarch of Lisbon. In a speech to a CDAC meeting in December 1912, Salazar argued that in their zealous campaign against privilege, the Republicans had created new forms of inequality and intolerance. As he saw it, liberty, equality, and fraternity were fundamentally Christian values, and such principles could not be realized in Portugal without the Church being at the center of political life. At Coimbra, Salazar was part of a small academic elite, many of whom would become important figures over the following decades. He had an active social life and several female admirers, including the 16-year-old Julia Perestreo, who, in addition to being one of his students, was also the daughter of his godmother. Once she got wind of the relationship, Julia's mother quickly moved to distance her from Salazar. Her daughter was not going to marry the son of her estate manager, no matter how academically gifted he might be. After graduation, Salazar accepted an offer from his friend Cerejeira to take up residence in a suite of rooms in a former monastery called Os Grios. The property was looked after by a young housekeeper named Maria de Jesus, who would later follow Salazar to Lisbon during his political career and become his closest female companion, though he would never marry. At Os Grios, Salazar applied to join the university faculty, but while he had a degree in law, Salazar applied for a position in the new economics department instead. As part of his application, he wrote 2 dissertations. The first argued that the Portuguese agrarian economy required reform and that farmers should abandon wheat and produce fruit and vegetables for export. In his second essay, which addressed Portugal's negative balance of trade, Salazar argued that the Portuguese economy should become self-sufficient and find export markets. Even before he had submitted these essays, Salazar became head of the Economics and Social Sciences section at Coimbra following the death of the incumbent professor. In 1918, he was promoted to full professor and awarded the title Doctor of Laws without any examination. Meanwhile, Portugal's entry into the First World War in 1916 and the poor performance of its armed forces on the Western Front and in its African colonies strengthened Salazar's view that it would take Portugal a long time to catch up with the rest of Europe. The perennial instability of the Portuguese Republic continued after the military officer Sidónio Pais took power in a coup in December 1917 and ruled as a strongman before his assassination almost exactly a year later. In March 1919, Salazar and 2 colleagues were unexpectedly suspended for being monarchists. Salazar downplayed his political activities and described himself merely as a defender of the Roman Catholic Church in Portugal. Within a month, he was reinstated. For all his efforts to understate his political ambitions, Salazar had risen up the ranks of a moderate Catholic political party, the Portuguese Catholic Centre. In 1919, Salazar stood as the party's candidate for the Viana do Castelo constituency north of the city of Porto, but his electoral performance was dismal on this occasion. When he was asked to stand for election again in 1921, he was elected to represent Guimarães, the birthplace of King Afonso I, who had founded the Kingdom of Portugal in 1140. Salazar was a reluctant parliamentarian and unwilling to leave Coimbra, but he attended the opening session of Parliament in July 1921. He was soon elected to a number of committees on economic affairs. Salazar did not believe that the Parliament would last very long. He was proven correct a few months later when a group of left-wing soldiers murdered Prime Minister António Granjo and several of his conservative allies. The bloody incident convinced Salazar that parliamentary democracy was not viable in Portugal. He became increasingly convinced of the necessity of the restoration of Christianity at the heart of Portuguese politics. In an address to the Catholic Centre Party's Congress in 1922, Salazar expressed his view that political authority came from God rather than any social contract, and urged Portuguese Catholics to come together to form a powerful political force that could not be ignored. He did not completely abandon electoral politics yet, though, and in 1925 he stood again for Parliament, unsuccessfully on this occasion. On the 28th of May 1926, General Manuel Gomes da Costa launched a military coup to overthrow the government. From Braga in northern Portugal, his forces marched south and took control of most of the country, bringing an end to Portugal's first republic that had only been in existence since 1910. The officers invited 3 university professors to join the new government, and Salazar was offered the Ministry of Finance. This was an unusual arrangement whereby a military regime quickly decided to establish a more technocratic government, staffed with experts who knew much about economics and other elements of civil government. Salazar reluctantly accepted, but resigned quickly when just days later, Gomes da Costa took the reins of power himself. Da Costa was himself ousted in early July. Salazar was happy to avoid the infighting. He agreed to head a tax reform commission under the new Minister of Finance, General João José Sinel de Corges, and spent several months meeting business leaders and economic experts. At the end of June, he submitted his report, which concluded that the system was too inefficient. There were too many taxes and too complex a system. Salazar publicized his findings in the press, which led to government censorship. While Sinel de Corges struggled to balance the books, Salazar appeared as a competent economist with practical ideas to sort out the government's disastrous financial position. Given the perilous state of the Portuguese government's finances, Sinel de Corges was obliged to seek a loan of £12 million from the League of Nations, which had been established as a forerunner of the United Nations in the aftermath of the First World War. This was through a branch of the League called the Economic and Financial Organization of the League of Nations, a predecessor of today's International Monetary Fund. The proposed conditions for the loan were deemed unacceptable by the Portuguese government and prevented Sinel de Corges from carrying out his intended reforms. From December 1927, the Catholic paper Novidades began publishing a series of articles by Salazar in which he recommended harsh austerity measures to improve Portugal's fiscal situation and restore faith in government credit. However, he also recognized that his proposed remedies would be painful and required sacrifices from both the government and the people to reduce public expenditure and balance the books. In line with his conservative instincts, Salazar argued that the state could not do this alone. It was up to Portuguese workers to increase their productivity and for families to reduce their consumption. While Salazar was preparing the ground for his bid for power, he became acquainted with Father Mateo Crowley Boivi, an Anglo-Peruvian priest and close confidant of Pope Pius XI. The The priest not only encouraged Manuel Cerejeira to place himself as the successor to the Patriarchate of Lisbon, but urged Salazar to abandon his academic career and focus on politics instead. Salazar did not have to wait long for another invitation to join the government. General Carmona sought to bolster his legitimacy as head of state by holding presidential elections in April 1928, in which he was the sole candidate. He appointed Colonel José Vicente de Freitas as his prime minister, who offered Salazar the finance ministry. Salazar was sworn into office on the 27th of April 1928, the eve of his 39th birthday. He would remain at the top of Portuguese politics for the next 4 decades. He recognized that as a technocrat in a military government, his position remained precarious. Since his Christian democratic political base was small, the only way he could guarantee his security was to make himself indispensable by successfully addressing Portugal's economic malaise. In July, he presented a budget that slashed expenditure and increased taxes. These measures would have caused an outcry in a democracy, since civil servants, army officers, and pensioners were all negatively affected. But he was able to ram the measures through under an autocratic government. Within a year, the government was running a surplus and would continue to do so into the 1930s, even as the Great Depression was impacting terribly on other countries. General Carmona recognized that his government depended on Salazar's financial management abilities, and his backing was crucial in July 1929, when a dispute over the right to ring church bells after 9 p.m. prompted a showdown between Salazar's friend and ally Mario de Figueiredo at the Ministry of Justice and Prime Minister de Freitas. Salazar leveraged his abilities as finance minister to protect the privileged status of the church in Portugal. Salazar's position as the key figure in Carmona's government was further strengthened in January 1930, when he outmaneuvered de Freitas' successor, General Artur Ivens Ferraz, a moderate who envisaged the eventual restoration of democracy. Salazar ensured that Ferraz was replaced by the compliant cavalry officer Domingos Oliveira. At the beginning of the year, Salazar proudly announced that the financial crisis was over and that the government could work on economic and social reforms. He increased tariffs to protect Portugal's nascent industries, while extending credit to stimulate economic development in the countryside. He also took steps to make Portugal self-sufficient in wheat production by encouraging farmers to open more land up for the cultivation of wheat with subsidies, and by offering a guaranteed price higher than the market. Admittedly, Portugal's improved financial situation owed something to economic reforms during the final years of the First Republic, but Salazar did a lot to bring stability to the economic situation and restore Portugal's international credit. Salazar's economic management also received praise from the Portuguese and the British press, though his economic policies were by no means universally popular. In response to criticisms that he was neglecting the common people, Salazar argued that the short-term economic pain was a price worth paying for the long-term gain from the state's investments in infrastructure. Salazar had also been criticized for neglecting Portugal's colonies. While Portugal's overseas empire was much smaller than it had once been, the country retained a substantial presence in Africa, most notably Angola and Mozambique. In late 1929, Salazar's conservative rival Francisco Cunha Leal urged the central government to provide financial aid to Angola to stabilize its finances and stimulate economic development. Salazar's refusal to do so, which put him at odds with most of the Ferraz ministry, led to the latter's resignation. In addition to his existing responsibilities as finance minister, Salazar was appointed interim minister of the colonies. He soon moved to dismiss Cunha Leal from his bank board positions, and within a few months he internally exiled him to the Azores Islands. Salazar then formulated the Colonial Act of April 1930, which re-centralized power in Lisbon and restricted the activities of foreign enterprises in the colonies. He challenged the English businessman Lord Kilsand, who controlled a large tract of land in northern Mozambique through his company, and faced down a protest from the British government to his refusal to renew Kilsand's contract. The Colonial Act served as the cornerstone of Portugal's colonial policy during Salazar's leadership, and he relinquished the colony's portfolio in late July 1930. Salazar's ruthless control of government spending had earned him the nickname the Dictator of Finance, and it would not be long before his dictatorship extended to the rest of the government. A major milestone in his rise to power was the creation of the National Union on the 30th of July 1930. While the official announcement was made by Domingos Oliveira, Salazar set out the founding principles of the organization, warning against the forces of revolutionary socialism and violent nationalism that had afflicted much of Europe as the Great Depression took hold across the continent. Salazar abolished all political parties and envisaged the National Union bringing together the country as supporters of his conservative vision of law and order. The National Union would not be a political party in the conventional sense. Instead, rather than mobilizing public opinion, it aimed to depoliticize Portuguese society. Its creation gave Salazar the opportunity to build a political base and reduce his dependence on the military. In December 1930, he delivered a speech before a military audience, which emphasized the army's role in preserving order and protecting the nation, rather than squabbling for power. Salazar gradually moved to replace military men within the government with civilians, most of whom were academics associated with the University of Coimbra. He could count on President Carmona to protect him from critics within the army. A sufficient number of troops remained loyal to the government to suppress uprisings against the government on the island of Madeira and in the Azores in 1931. Salazar further consolidated his power by bringing in Mário Paes de Sousa as Interior Minister, with responsibility for maintaining order and organizing elections and plebiscites to shore up support for the government. By the early summer of 1932, Salazar and his allies were actively campaigning for his appointment as the new Prime Minister. Domingos Oliveira resigned as Prime Minister, and on the 5th of July 1932, Salazar assumed the position as head of government. The process was not as smooth as Salazar intended. Several of his ideological allies in the Catholic integralist movement were disappointed that he did not announce his support for restoring the monarchy. The childless former king, Manuel II, had died in exile in England only days before Salazar took over as head of the Portuguese government. Salazar granted him a state funeral, but was careful not to encourage monarchist sentiment. Instead, he introduced a new constitution in March 1933 to create what he termed the Estado Novo, or New State. While the presidency was retained, power was concentrated in Salazar's hands as Prime Minister. Article 8 of the Constitution set out rights including property rights and freedom of assembly, but also authorized extensive state censorship. The question of whether the Estado Novo was a fascist state has been a source of academic debate. Most scholars describe Salazar as an authoritarian conservative rather than a fascist. Unlike Hitler and Mussolini, he did not agitate for racial violence, and while his government was repressive and often violent, it was nowhere near as brutal as a huge proportion of its contemporaries across Europe in the 1930s. As such, the Estado Novo might best be characterized as a corporatist state, corporatism being a more moderate form of fascism that was also in vogue in countries like Austria in the mid-1930s. Franco's regime in Spain was quite corporatist, though with a greater emphasis on military rule than prevailed in Portugal. This extended to the regime's economic policy. Salazar was avowedly anti-socialist and anti-communist, but he was also skeptical of capitalism. He favored the doctrine of corporatism, which encouraged cooperation between labor and capital. The right to strike was abolished. Instead, businesses and workers were encouraged to come together to agree on pay and conditions. While Salazar continued to believe that the Catholic Church had an important role to play in Portuguese society, he moved away from recognizing it as a state religion and sought to depoliticize the Church. Salazar's approach won favor with many Catholics in Portugal, who recognized that his government was guided by Christian values, yet not dominated by the power of the Church. Salazar was not a natural orator or a demagogue like Mussolini or Hitler. He did, however, operate a slick propaganda machine that extolled the achievements of the Estado Novo. By arranging interviews with the European press and publishing books hailing the progress made since Salazar became finance minister, the Portuguese leader acquired a reputation as a financial maverick who had restored Portugal's fiscal standing during the Great Depression. Despite these efforts, Salazar faced opposition from several fronts. The greatest threat to the Estado Novo in its earliest years came from the far-right national syndicalist or blue shirt movement led by Francisco Rolau Preto, a political agitator who was inspired by the rise to power of the Nazis in Germany in January 1933. Salazar responded by limiting Preto's reach through censorship and undermined his organization by co-opting some of its members into the National Union. The Estado Novo also faced a threat from the Portuguese Communist Party. In late 1935, Communist Party leader Bento Gonçalves was arrested and sent to the Cape Verde Islands. A sign of the temperamental political environment was seen in July 1937, when Salazar narrowly survived an assassination attempt by anarchists and communists who detonated a bomb near his vehicle as he was visiting a friend. One dimension of Salazar's anti-communist struggle was the Spanish Civil War, which had broken out in July 1936. He had anticipated a power struggle between left and right in Spain, and sympathized with Spanish nationalists seeking to overthrow the left-wing Republican government. While Portugal was nominally part of the Non-Intervention Committee set up by the British and French governments, Salazar allowed nationalist forces to operate from Portugal and placed no restrictions on Portuguese volunteers fighting for the Spanish nationalists. Although he welcomed General Francisco Franco's rise to power and officially recognized his government in April 1938, Salazar was aware that Portuguese sovereignty was at risk from Spanish nationalists who envisaged an Iberian Union. During the anxious period that followed, the Portuguese leader also faced a challenge to his leadership from the military. In May 1936, he took control of the War Ministry and appointed one of his former students from Coimbra, Lieutenant Fernando dos Santos Costa, as his deputy. The two men worked to reduce the size of the army. The announcement of severe cuts in 1938 led Salazar's predecessor, Domingos Oliveira, to join soldiers in Lisbon in calling for his removal. President Carmona came to the rescue once again by threatening to resign if Salazar were forced out of office. Salazar believed in the late 1930s that a major European war was imminent. Although he admired certain aspects of Mussolini's government, Salazar had opposed the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in East Africa in 1936. With a fresh European war building and also conscious of the long-standing Anglo-Portuguese alliance, which in one form or another dated back to the 14th century, Salazar was determined to maintain neutrality in the event of another global conflict. This suited the British, who saw Portuguese neutrality as essential for keeping Spain out of the war and safeguarding their hold on the Rock of Gibraltar. At the end of the Spanish Civil War, Portugal and Spain had signed a non-aggression pact, but after Italy entered the war in June 1940, Spain began to show an interest in joining the war. The British and Portuguese ambassadors in Madrid, Sir Samuel Hoare and Teotonio Pereira, worked closely to maintain Spanish neutrality, and when Franco and Hitler met in October 1940, the two dictators failed to agree on an alliance. Nevertheless, German forces in southern France threatened to take over the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. In the event, the Axis forces were distracted by events in the Balkans, and preparations for any intervention in Iberia were abandoned after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Salazar's preferred solution of a compromise peace in Europe became less likely after the Soviet Union and the United States joined the Allies in 1941. While Salazar denounced German aggression, he continued to believe that the Soviet Union was the greatest threat to Europe, and he was also reluctant to see America intervene in Europe. His efforts to defend Portuguese independence from both the Axis and Allies were accompanied by initiatives to promote Portuguese nationalism at home, such as the commemorations of the 800th anniversary of the country's foundation all the way back in 1139. With much of Europe under Axis occupation, Lisbon was also teeming with refugees who had fled from France through Spain to Portugal, even including the former King of the United Kingdom, Edward VIII, who had arrived at Lisbon from Paris. Salazar criticized Hitler's racial policies and allowed Lisbon to be used as a transit hub for European refugees to cross the Atlantic. After the war, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, was credited with saving the lives of thousands of French Jews by issuing them with Portuguese visas, regardless of whether they had the means to travel beyond Portugal. Despite Salazar's willingness to maintain cordial relations with the British government and vice versa, the Allies became increasingly frustrated with him after 1942, as the tide of war began to swing in their favour. In late 1941, Salazar had been irritated by a Dutch-Australian force preemptively occupying the Portuguese colony of Timor in the Indonesian archipelago, shortly before Japanese forces overran the island. After General Montgomery's victory over Rommel at El Alamein in November 1942, Salazar and President Carmona were informed by British and American diplomats in early December that Allied forces planned to launch an amphibious operation in North Africa to expel what remained of the Axis presence. Allied leaders recognized the strategic value of the Azores in the Battle of the Atlantic and were keen to establish a base on the Portuguese island chain. Winston Churchill planned to issue an ultimatum to Salazar, threatening to seize the islands by force if the Portuguese refused to allow the Allies to use its naval facilities. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden persuaded Churchill to pursue a more diplomatic approach, and by June 1943, Salazar agreed in principle to allow British forces to use the Azores. A deal was finally negotiated in October 1943, though the British continued to be irritated by Salazar's decision to continue trading with the Germans as the war went on. Salazar was eventually persuaded to embargo exports of any kind that could be used for the war effort in Germany in mid-1944. While Salazar's diplomacy kept the country out of the war, Portugal was not immune to its economic impacts. The Battle of the Atlantic disrupted supplies of food and fuel, triggering protests from the summer of 1942. Although Salazar had formally given up the finance ministry in 1940, his inability to improve matters undermined his reputation as an economic wizard. The Communist Party gained strength among Portuguese workers. News of Mussolini's fall from power in Rome in July 1943 inspired a powerful protest against the regime in Lisbon, but Salazar's government faced down the challenge. Despite talk of General Carmona being persuaded to lead a coup to remove him, Salazar weathered the storm during the war years, and the defeat of the Axis powers in Europe in May 1945 saw the emergency begin to pass. Still, Salazar now felt adrift at home and abroad, as his brand of corporate nationalism was increasingly out of place in the liberal democratic system which replaced it around Western Europe in the post-war era. Salazar believed that he had skillfully steered the Portuguese ship of state through the narrow straits of neutrality during the war, and was eager to test the regime's popularity by bringing forward elections to the National Assembly to November 1945. While Salazar was confident that the Portuguese people would deliver a strong vote of confidence in him, he was surprised when his old friend, Cardinal Cerejeira, refused to endorse the National Union over the opposition alliance known as the Movement of Democratic Unity. After the opposition boycotted the elections in response to measures to restrict democratic freedoms, the collapse in turnout on election day was not the full-throated endorsement that Salazar had envisaged. Many of Salazar's close associates warned him that the Estado Novo was losing its luster and urged him to introduce social welfare reforms. Salazar refused to do so and maintained his conservative approach. This aside, foreign observers in the US, Britain and France were happy to see a right-wing ruler remaining in power who would block Portugal from falling into the Soviet camp in the developing Cold War. Salazar's skepticism about foreign aid and American intentions led him to reject an initial offer of financial assistance through the Marshall Plan that the US had set up to facilitate the post-war reconstruction of Europe. An increase in the cost of imports forced him to change course, and Portugal eventually received $90 million over 4 years. Salazar was equally skeptical of the negotiations to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He supported its anti-communist objectives, but was afraid that the United States would use NATO as a platform to challenge Portugal's colonial policy. Despite his reservations, Portugal was among the 12 founding members of the alliance when it launched on the 4th of April 1949. By 1949, Salazar's domestic political situation seemed more secure, as the secret police cracked down on the Portuguese communists by arresting its de facto leader, Álvaro Cunhal, who remained in captivity until a daring escape 11 years later. The post-war period also saw Salazar strengthen his relations with his ideological ally Franco. Franco paid his first and only state visit to Portugal in October 1949, while Salazar visited Franco in Spain the following summer. Portugal and Spain both joined the United Nations in December 1955. While Franco enthusiastically pursued closer relations with the US during the 1950s, Salazar continued to be wary about American anti-colonialist rhetoric, as he was determined to maintain control over Angola, Mozambique, Timor, and the Cape Verde Islands. Salazar insisted on maintaining centralized control, though his minister of the colonies, Marcelo Caetano, was in favor of granting some form of self-government to the colonies to assuage their calls for independence. Shortly after his appointment in 1944, Caetano commissioned a report into abuses in colonial administration from the army officer Henrique Galvão, an expert on colonial affairs, who had represented Angola in the National Assembly since 1940. In January 1947, Galvão submitted a report to the National Assembly, setting out systematic abuses of the native population in Angola. He found that Angolans were forced to work by the colonial authorities and faced appalling conditions that led to a high mortality rate. Rather than galvanizing Lisbon into action, Galvão infuriated Caetano by presenting his report to the National Assembly without informing the minister. Until his arrest in early 1952, Galvão was one of the most vehement critics of Salazar's government. With the exception of the Communist Party, most of Salazar's political opponents hoped to maintain the empire, but they objected to his stubborn approach to colonial matters and his turning a blind eye to abuses. Although Salazar recognized that the status quo was untenable by repealing the Colonial Act in 1951 and renaming colonies as overseas territories, the changes fell far short of Galvão's preferred solution of a Portuguese African federation. During this period, another constitutional question reared its head when the death of 81-year-old President Oscar Carmona in April 1951 encouraged some of Salazar's ministers to call for the restoration of the monarchy under Dom Duarte Nuno, the German-born descendant of King Miguel I. Salazar's closest advisers were divided on the issue until Minister of Defense Santos Costa warned that the army was unlikely to support the restoration of the monarchy. After several weeks, Santos Costa recommended General Francisco Higino Craveiro Lopes, an obscure Air Force officer who had briefly served as governor of Goa in India, and who was expected to limit himself to the ceremonial aspects of the office. The general was elected president in the late summer of 1951, but would prove less compliant to Salazar's wishes than Carmona had been. Despite his difficulties during the period immediately after the war, Salazar's prospects were improving by 1952. He received a vote of confidence from the international community when Lisbon hosted a major NATO conference in February 1952. The US Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, was impressed by the 63-year-old Portuguese leader. While Salazar welcomed General Dwight Eisenhower's election as President of the United States in November 1952, his relationship with America and NATO continued to be guided by Portuguese self-interest, and he was only willing to grant the United States a base in the Azores on a 5-year lease subject to renewal. With his government otherwise on a more stable footing, Salazar was able to focus on industrial policy, launching his first development plan in 1952, which focused on developing energy and transport infrastructure to boost economic productivity. As Portugal remained a predominantly agrarian economy, Salazar's policies only benefited a small industrial elite. Throughout the 1950s, Salazar maintained his policy to achieve economic self-sufficiency. He was unenthusiastic about the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, which would become the European Economic Community in 1958 and eventually the European Union. While Salazar feared that European integration would infringe on Portuguese sovereignty, by the end of the decade he was persuaded to move towards economic cooperation. Correira's diplomatic initiatives were instrumental in ensuring that Portugal overcame British concerns to join the European Free Trade Association in 1960. During the early 1960s, Portugal joined the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Increasing foreign investment into the Portuguese economy enabled GDP to grow by 7% during the 1960s. Portugal may have been an economic success story during the 1960s, but from 1958 onwards, the Salazar regime would come under unrelenting pressure within Portugal and further afield. From within his government, Marcelo Caetano was already being spoken of as a successor to an aging leader who had been in power for nearly 3 decades. Salazar decided that it was too risky to allow the president a second term, and instead nominated Navy Minister Américo Tomás for the 1958 elections. The opposition had rallied behind the 52-year-old Air Force General Humberto Delgado, who had acquired plenty of diplomatic experience at NATO meetings. While Delgado had been a radical right-winger who expressed sympathy for Hitler during the war, discontent with Salazar's regime was such that even the communists backed his cause. Salazar was surprised by the enthusiastic reception that Delgado received around the country, and Minister of Defense Santos Costa was ordered to mobilize National Guardsmen to disperse crowds that had gathered to support Delgado at his rallies. Delgado was convinced that Salazar would not be prepared to grant him the presidency even if he won the election, but failed to persuade fellow officers to back a coup. According to the official results after the election on the 8th of June 1958, Delgado received just under a quarter of the votes cast on a turnout of 77%. The fact that the official results showed Delgado unexpectedly winning in some rural areas indicates that his vote share in the major cities of Lisbon and Porto were significantly understated, and that he would have won the election had it been a fair and open one. Salazar decided to take no chances and abolished direct elections to the presidency thereafter. While Delgado went into exile in Britain, in 1959 Salazar heard that Enrique Galvão had escaped to the Argentine embassy and thence on to Argentina and Venezuela. In January 1961, Galvão and a small group of armed men seized a Portuguese liner, the Santa Maria, and attempted to sail to Angola and inspire an uprising against Salazar among the Portuguese settler population. While Galvão never reached Angola, his attempt may have triggered revolts from the indigenous population in the capital of Luanda and in northern Angola, which would claim thousands of lives as Portuguese settlers fought back. Salazar had little international support at a time when Britain and France were rapidly granting their many colonies across Africa independence, and on the 13th of March, the United States voted in favour of a UN resolution condemning Portuguese colonialism. In late March, Salazar's Defence Minister Botelho Muniz urged him to grant the colonies greater autonomy, and when he refused, Muniz and other senior army officers planned a coup. President Tomás proved vital in ensuring Salazar's survival by agreeing to dismiss Muniz as defense minister and appoint Salazar himself. This announcement on the 13th of April 1961 put an end to the coup. Salazar deployed a force of 10,000 men to suppress the uprising in northern Angola. Salazar's colonial policy was problematic for his Western allies. He was irritated by the policy of the new Kennedy administration in the United States, which urged decolonization to build up independent African countries as a barrier against Soviet interests. When Salazar formed his new cabinet after the Muniz coup, his new foreign minister Alberto Franco Nogueira adopted a more assertive position on Portugal's colonial interests. Portugal's only bargaining chip was the Azores, and Salazar's intransigence in giving in to US demands during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 prompted Kennedy to change his Africa policy in Portugal's favour shortly before his assassination in November 1963. As a sign of improved bilateral relations, the US offered financial and engineering support for the construction of the first bridge across the River Tagus in Lisbon, which was named the Salazar Bridge upon its completion in 1966. This structure, bearing a strong resemblance to San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge, was subsequently renamed the Bridge of 25th April to commemorate the date of the Carnation Revolution of 1974 that overthrew the Estado Novo. Within Europe, Salazar found a staunch ally for his colonial policy in Charles de Gaulle, the President of France, who also resisted the expansion of American influence in Europe and who had spent many years fighting a bloody and bitter colonial war in French Algeria through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. Colonial affairs remained high on the agenda throughout the 1960s. In 1961, Salazar seemed prepared to support the reforms of Adriano Moreira, his Minister of the Overseas Provinces, who proposed giving Africans equal civil and economic rights and abolishing forced labor requirements in Angola and Mozambique. The following year, a showdown between Moreira and the Portuguese general who served as governor of Angola eventually resulted in both men leaving office. As a result, the Portuguese military continued fighting a costly war to maintain its empire, which eventually cost 40% of Portugal's annual GDP. By then, it is debatable whether Salazar simply had the energy to continue trying to deal with these problems. He was in his 70s and had been in power for over 3 decades. Despite his resilience in office, he was not prepared to entertain a radical shake-up of the Portuguese constitutional fabric by divesting some of his powers. To worsen matters, as his health gradually deteriorated, Salazar's regime was embarrassed by 2 particular incidents. On the 13th of February 1965, Humberto Delgado, the popular former Air Force commander, was killed by the Portuguese secret police just across the Spanish border. It is unclear if Salazar ordered the assassination, and while he reportedly remarked that Delgado's death was regrettable, he also protected the agents responsible for the assassination. Then, in December 1967, many high-profile figures, including the economy minister José Correia de Oliveira, were implicated in a child prostitution scandal. Justice Minister João Antunes Varela resigned from the government when Salazar closed down the investigation into the scandal. In August 1968, Salazar suffered an accident after falling from his deck chair and hit his head on a stone surface. Although there was no immediate obvious damage, a few weeks later he fell into a coma, and his old friend Cardinal Cerejeira was urgently summoned to administer the last rites. President Thomas carried out his constitutional duty and appointed Marcelo Caetano as the new Prime Minister. Against all odds, Salazar rallied after his serious health scare in the autumn of 1968. By February 1969, he was able to leave hospital and was taken to his official residence. His mental faculties were clearly impaired. He had not been explicitly informed that he was no longer Prime Minister and seemed to labour under the impression that he was still in charge. In the meantime, Caetano ran the Estado Novo and provided continuity, refusing to make diplomatic concessions. Almost 2 years after his coma, Salazar finally died of kidney failure on the 27th of July 1970 at the age of 81. After a funeral service at the Jerónimos Monastery in Belém, the final resting place of the great Portuguese explorer of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Vasco da Gama, and the Portuguese national poet Luís de Camões, Salazar's body was taken by train to Santa Comba João, and thence to the cemetery at Vimeiro. His death left a power vacuum at the heart of the Estado Novo state that Caetano struggled to fill, and on the 25th of April 1974, Caetano and the Estado Novo were overthrown in the Carnation Revolution, a bloodless coup which owed its name to the flowers that protesters placed in the gun muzzles of government soldiers. The revolution began in a very peculiar manner. In those days, in Portugal, despite fighting multiple colonial wars in Africa since the start of the 1960s, the Portuguese Army, Navy and Air Force did not have interconnected communication systems. Therefore, the military officers who launched the coup needed to come up with some means of alerting their co-conspirators countrywide that the plan was going ahead. They decided that the best way of doing so was to air 2 predetermined songs on Portugal's radio stations an hour and a half apart as a signal that the coup was to commence. The first of these was Paulo de Carvalho's E Depois de Adeus, and After the Goodbye, Portugal's entry into the Eurovision Song Contest that had been held just 3 weeks earlier. De Carvalho's entry had not exactly performed well, coming joint last with only 3 points in the same contest that was won by ABBA's Waterloo. E Depois de Adeus was derided enough that it was not being played on Portuguese stations after the Eurovision, and was chosen as one of the 2 songs that signalled the start of the coup. It was played at 10:55 p.m. on the night of the 24th of April, followed by the second song, Grandole Vila Morena, nearly an hour and a half later. Not long after midnight on the 25th, the unusual signal system worked, and the coup commenced in the early hours of the 25th of April. Portugal quickly transitioned to a liberal democracy and granted its colonies independence. Both Angola and Mozambique collapsed into civil war after being granted independence, while Indonesia invaded East Timor, initiating a conflict there that would last a quarter of a century. Portugal joined the EEC in 1986 along with Spain, which had also transitioned very quickly to a liberal democratic system after the death of Franco in 1975. António Salazar left behind a complicated legacy. Rising from a relatively humble background and having once considered becoming a priest, he entered the Portuguese government after the Republic was overthrown in the 1920s. As a technocrat, he gained power through his successful management of the Portuguese economy and rose to become the virtual dictator of Portugal by 1932. Because this was the age of fascism, he is sometimes mentioned in the same vein as Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy. But Salazar's regime was quite different. He was not a demagogue who persecuted ethnic and religious minorities, though his colonial policy was retrograde and he refused to decolonize even as Britain and France were doing so across Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. Furthermore, unlike Franco, his government was not dominated by the military, though it did require military support. Instead, he owed his rise to power to the perception that he would offer competent financial management. Widely admired in Portugal and abroad for his economic management during the 1930s and his neutrality during the Second World War, Salazar's government stagnated in the post-war era as countries like France and West Germany benefited from uniting economically as liberal democracies. Salazar's final decades in power were characterized by an eclectic combination of mixed economic growth, alignment with the United States in the Cold War, a stubborn policy to maintain control of Portugal's overseas territories, and the emergence of more robust political opposition in Portugal itself. In the end, he simply passed his sell-by date after decades in power, and Portugal was ready, like Spain, to move to become a liberal democracy in the 1970s. His legacy was a mix of good and bad. What do you think of António Salazar? Was he a brilliant politician who restored political stability to Portugal after decades of crisis and decline? Or was he a dictator who suppressed political freedoms and held onto office for far too long? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.